Let's see if we have about 2 minutes, so she's going to do a review now.
This is just how my living room is right now, but if it's distracting, I can take it down.
Yeah.
It's fine.
We've been, folks are, doing doing whatever they can, given the situation. So we've done a bunch of these now, and people are in all sorts of circumstances. It's pretty informal. Okay, let's see if she's okay. So
and who listens to you? Who watches you? Who listens to you? Who tunes in?
Yeah, we've got a wide variety of people. We are actually live right now. So what I'll do, just so you know, is I'll when we're done, I'll cut it off, hang up, and then I'll call you right back.
Sure.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay. So let me just see. Okay, we're going to begin. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch. I am the Director of Public Programs at the Polis Project. Today, we're pleased to welcome Nina Lakhani. Nina Lakhani is the environmental justice reporter for The Guardian US and has previously reported extensively on and from Central America for The Guardian, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Global Post, and The Daily Beast, among many other publications. She's also the author of the book that we are going to be talking about today, Who Killed Berta Cáceres? Dams, Death Squads, and an Indigenous Defender's Battle for the Planet, which has just been published by Verso Books. Nina Lakhani, welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon.
Thanks very much.
So before we begin, just a brief note to our audience. Part of the goal here, as always, is to simulate, to the extent possible, an actual book event, which means that we're going to try to make this an interactive conversation with our audience. So if you're out there and watching and you have a question for our guest, please send it along to the Polis Project Twitter account, which can be accessed at project_Polis, and if time permits, we will be happy to ask it. But without further ado, let's get started. Nina, if you could begin, I was hoping that we could set the stage sort of for the book. Can you start by giving us a sense, for those of us that might not be familiar with Berta Cáceres, a sense of who she was and her importance within Honduras and Central American politics more broadly?
Sure. So Berta Cáceres was an indigenous grassroots leader from Western Honduras. She had co-founded a organization called PIN to fight for the rights, the human rights, the land rights of the indigenous Lenca people, which is one of 7 indigenous groups in Honduras. So she was very much a grassroots leader, but she was also, a sharp political analyst. She was a defender of equality, of LGBTQ rights. She was very much at the forefront and fighting for and advocating for equality across the board, really. And I think, a key thing about Berta is that every injustice was her injustice. She didn't close her eyes, turn away to any injustice or inequality. And while she represented the Lenca people in Western Honduras, she was very much somebody that learned from the experiences and the struggles of community struggles, especially indigenous struggles globally. She visited and spent time with Native American communities, First Nation communities, and way beyond the Americas, in Europe and Asia and Africa. And she learned, that's how she learned and evolved her understanding of how these local struggles were manifestations of global economic, political, military, social powers, really, or events, and strategies. And so she very much, from a very young age, her experiences, from growing up during proxy Cold Wars across Central America, growing up in that sort of in the dirty wars and participating in the El Salvadoran Civil War. She was always outward looking, but she remained until the end, a grassroots leader. She did not, she ended up being the face of the Lenca people. partly because of this international role that she had, and also because she won the Goldman Prize for environmental environmental activism in 2015. But she was a really bona fide grassroots leader. She didn't make decisions top down. She'd made decisions from the base, and she never lost that.
Yeah. One of the things that you argue in the book, and you made mention just a moment ago, is that to understand Berta's life and death, you need to understand the broader Cold War history of Honduras. So I was wondering if you could discuss this context, namely the special relationship that Honduras has had with the United States, and the ways in which counterinsurgency doctrine reshaped the sociopolitical landscape of the country during this period.
Sure. I mean, so Berta was born in 1971. At a point where there was neighboring Guatemala was already in the middle of brutal civil war. There was social uprisings in El Salvador, in Nicaragua. And at the time where the number one enemy for the US were so-called communists. It's become this sort of ideological battle, and Central America became a key proxy war staging post for that. But through her, and so what you saw really is that Honduras became, the coup in Guatemala that led to the 36-year brutal civil war was staged from Honduras, and that happened partially thanks to a piece of legislation passed in 1954 that was written by the Americans that really allowed the US to use Honduras as a military satellite. That law continues to be used today. US continues to use Honduras as its base for its war on drugs, even today. And it was in Honduras where mercenaries and right-wing fighters from Guatemala were trained and armed to execute that coup in Guatemala against the first democratically elected president, which eventually led to the murder of almost 200,000 mainly indigenous rural people. And really, Honduras didn't have an official civil war. There was one in El Salvador, there was one in Nicaragua, but Honduras was very much the geopolitical military base for the US, and Berta grew up in that environment, so firsthand, just even going back one step, she was the youngest of 12 children, and on her mum's side of the family, they were very politically and socially active. Her mother, her maternal grandmother, her grandfather, they had all suffered, repression at the hands of various dictators and military dictators over the years, and she had, with her mum, sort of experienced really the absolute neglect and inequality suffered by indigenous and rural people, because her mum was a midwife and she would accompany her mum, to help these women in terrible conditions give birth, and she would also accompany her mum on medical missions to the refugee camps set up on the border of Honduras and El Salvador, which we now know that we know that Honduran forces would let Salvadoran right-wing sort of troops into these refugee camps. So she grew up in that environment. Her home was very much a focal point for thinkers, for guerrilla fighters who were either escaping from persecution or resting, and she was hearing all of this. She had politically active siblings, her mom, and that was the environment that she grew up in. And so then by the early 80s, when Reagan is elected, it's the line in the sand, right? And he makes a decision that Nicaragua will be the line in the sand, and Honduras is where they are going to stop this communist rot. And he sends over John Negroponte, who had cut his teeth with Henry Kissinger as ambassador to Honduras, and it's a day and night change. Huge amounts of money and personnel are sent to Honduras, and really, the military are given not only the green light, they are supported, to really, to do what's been done in the rest of the region. Anybody even suspected of having suspected of planning to protest or stand up against inequality is considered an enemy, and for this enemy, the communists, for the communist enemy, the end justifies the mean. That was the doctrine of the Cold War, and that's why you have this massive injection and amplification of special forces across the region where, really quite amateur armed forces are turned into these professional killing machines. And Honduras, there was an army base in the north of Honduras, which was the regional training center for these special forces, where the US conducted a training, but also they brought over the Argentine and Chilean death squads that had, military death squads that they had trained previously and were now experts in torture and disappearance and those things. And so some of the worst atrocities committed during the civil wars of the 80s in Central America, those units were trained in Honduras, and that's where the Contras were trained and launched, to fight against the Sandinistas after they had won that civil war. And so while there was never an official civil war and there was never anywhere near as much bloodshed in Honduras as there were in its neighboring countries, it was a very particular and sort of special relationship, and not in a good way, of just really social movements either being co-opted, or neutralized in different ways, and that really sort of sets the scene of where we are today.
Yeah. Jumping forward just a little bit, you note that the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas was critically important to Berta's evolution as an activist, and at least in part inspired the Pilgrim Marches later that year, which really put Berta on the map and re-energized indigenous social movements in Honduras. And I was really moved by this part of the book and your discussion of the Pilgrim Marches. Can you talk more about what they were and the effect that they had on labor, human rights, and other activist organizing in the country?
I think when you look back, I think, Berta will be, and her organisation will be very much, this will be a key part of her legacy for generations to come. Until then, really, until these Pilgrim Marches took place, nobody really thought of Honduras having indigenous people. Including the majority of Hondurans, they were considered like a relic of the past, And so then when she and COPIN, her whole collective organisation, decide to march from the hills in western Honduras to the capital Tegucigalpa, but on foot, to really sort of plant, to show that Honduras and the world that we are here, we exist, and we are going to demand and fight for our rights. They are joined by the other indigenous groups and the Garifunas from the north, and they all come together from their different sorts of territories and march together to Honduras, to Tegucigalpa, sorry. And it was sort of, I think, really, it was like, people were shocked. It was like these people are still alive, they still exist, And it was a real sort of that was a real, marking of intention, that we are here and we are no longer going to be relegated to to stories about the past. And that really sort of, I guess that was acted as a catalyst both nationally and internationally for indigenous peoples of Honduras to be recognized, and and there was a whole sort of series of victories over the following years. Honduras signed up to the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, that which we know as the ILO 169. It ratified that. They were recognized as it was recognized as a multi-ethnic country, multilingual country for the first time. Special prosecutor's office was set up to deal with complaints or violations of the ILO, and they started really. It was a battle for territory from the beginning. That indigenous rights are land rights. It's about territory and the ability and the right to self-determination about what happens on your territory, and the use of natural resources, which indigenous peoples globally have taught us for centuries. Use those natural resources in a very respectful, balanced, sustainable way. They were not exploited. They weren't sort of pulled out of the ground or exploited in different ways for profit. And so there were these victories, and early on, especially, a lot of the early sort of battles were to stop illegal logging on their territory, you know. And so even then, you saw these little networks of landowners, local politicians, criminals, you know, corrupt officials, etc. And they would use peaceful means of roadblocks, of protests, and they successfully stopped many of these illegal logging projects on their territory. And yeah, that was, and it was always, you know, like you mentioned, the Zapatistas. Absolutely, the Zapatistas uprising was a huge influence on Copin. But for Berta and and Salvador Zuniga, who co-founded the organization with her, their struggle was always going to be an unarmed struggle. You know, they had both been in the El Salvadoran War, and they had seen enough bloodshed, and they had also seen that not a single war was won in the end on the battlefield. You know, that and so that was, you know, it was always very much it was always going to be an unarmed struggle.
Yeah. One of the things I want to go back to is that you mentioned a moment ago was ILO 169, which, you know, on the one hand was a clear win, right, from the Pilgrim marches, but at the same time it really came to shape, I think, as your book points out, contests between the state, between private interest and local communities over land protection and resources in sometimes very disturbing ways. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what ILO 169 is, and how it's kind of conditioned struggles for environmental justice in Honduras ever since.
Yeah, so the ILO stands for the International Labour Organization, and it's like a institution of the UN, right? And it was a precursor. It was a convention that was signed in 1989, and it was a precursor to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. And it's very much, in very simple, you know, sort of in a summary, it's about recognizing the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples to self-determination, to have the right to be consulted, and make decisions about any type of project that will impact their territory, their way of life, their culture, the resources that they depend upon, and that my interpretation of that, and the international, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights interpretation of that, is that includes the right to say no, right? It includes the right to a veto. There are many those who support, but who are part of the extractive industries, you know, that say that that's wrong, that people don't have the right to say no, but that's not what the courts have ruled. And so that, and a key part of that is the consultation, the legally binding requirement to consult a community before any project is licensed or sanctioned on their territory. And it should be a dynamic process, right? So if you consult a community about, I don't know, a 1 megawatt dam, and then you want to turn it into a 10 megawatt dam, that's obviously going to be, you know, that's going to change, that's going to have many implications. That has to be a dynamic process. And what we've seen in Honduras and I reported for Mexico and Central America for almost 7 years, but across the continent, you know, right, that is just a constant, almost, total failure to consult communities in this, you know, to conduct consultations that are free, prior, and informed. You know, so that and it just doesn't happen. There isn't a single project in Honduras where that has happened, and, you know, not one. And so what you had was that you had the ILO, Honduras ratifying ILO 169, but at the same time, you know, this is the early 90s, you had the opening up of international markets. You know, you had the Washington Consensus, you know, the sort of the push from international monetary funds, and international banks, etc., that, you know, really imposing, you know, like this idea that, okay, well, the way to get poor countries out of poverty is to exploit their natural resources, is to, you know, and we are going to give you access to international money to do that, and that really, was that money and that capital was only ever available to a very tiny group of elites. It was never going to be available to communities for small projects, sustainable projects. We're talking about mines, we're talking about cash crops for export, African palm, sugarcane, all sorts of sort of big projects, and really, and really the rollout of free market principles in order to access this money, free trade, signing up to free trade agreements. That's all happening at the same time. And clearly there is a major clash between these sort of legal paradigms and economic and political discourses and laws like that were put into place, and so immediately these would be clashing, right from the beginning. And we've seen that sort of those clashes become more and more confrontational and more bloody, really, as the years have gone on.
Yeah. One of the things that you point out in the book is that the 2009 coup in Honduras changed the nature of this confrontation, as it did many other things. And I'm wondering, if you can talk a little bit about the ways in which the coup really upended Honduran society and influenced the course of events in Berta's life, as well as the Lenca people more broadly. And what was the effect on indigenous land struggles, as well as other issues across the country during this time and ever since?
So the coup, which was orchestrated and implemented in June 2009, I mean, it absolutely is a before, and it marks a before and an after in the story of Honduras. Very much like, I think the arrival of Negroponte did in the early 80s. And it really, unleashed a nightmare that has not stopped evolving. I think it was the end of democracy in Honduras. It was the beginning of the total capturing of Honduran institutions, the state by criminal elements. It's really, I would describe Honduras as not as a broken state, as a criminal state. And what we saw was that it became the most violent country in the world outside a war zone generally, and it became, the targeted violence as well was really noteworthy. It became the most dangerous place in the world to be an attorney, to be one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman, to be a member of the LGBTQ community, to be a journalist, and to be a defender of the environment and land. And all those things are important, but especially, the final one, because we're talking about Berta, is that what we saw happen is a total sell-off of natural resources in Honduras. So we saw hundreds of mega projects, dozens just in the Lenca territory, right? So cash crops, mines, hydroelectric dams, other renewable energy projects, tourism projects, all sorts, logging, just licensed and sanctioned in mostly rural and coastal areas, which are mostly indigenous territories, not exclusively, but mostly, without any debate, without any consultation at all, and so you have this sort of situation where these concessions to dams, for example, which are usually about 100 pages long, sort of, they involve all sorts of different licenses and contracts and so forth, being signed in Congress, being approved in Congress, like many of them at the same time in these midnight sessions in Congress, just completely, in the most opaque way you possibly can find. And communities often find out about them when heavy machinery turned up to start constructing a road or start work. And so then what you saw is that communities like Berta's organising to try and stop these projects, organising to and trying to talk to and negotiate with and with the people involved, trying to find out information, which is incredibly hard in Honduras. A lack of transparency in both the public and private sector is shocking, and on purpose. That's not a coincidence. and communities tried to organise to stop, and those communities that organised were repressed, so these private entities, these companies that had got companies that had been licensed, to do, to construct these, these energy projects. For example, when communities organised and tried to stop them, they could count on their influence in the state, and by that I mean police, army, prosecutors, judges, local officials, sometimes national politicians, to try and to repress the community through militarization, through they would all they would use classic counterinsurgency tactics of divide and conquer, dividing the community, offering jobs to some families, buying land of some families, and creating these sort of conflict then between communities. Arrest warrants, charges against community members who were, at the forefront of campaigns, threats, aggression, violence, all, harassment, defamation campaigns. Berta, for example, was, frequently labelled anti-development, a terrorist, no longer a communist, you're a terrorist, right? And, anti-development, suffered that whole gambit of, the tactics, classic counterinsurgency tactics, she was threatened, she was criminalized, they tried to jail her, that, she suffered sexual harassment, members of the community leadership were attacked and killed, local thugs were hired to work alongside the dam company, who also had the military and police literally working, it looked like working for them. They would be sleeping in the dam installation, and so just this sort of, and you just create this sort of pressure, constant pressure on these communities, and the objective is to neutralize the threat, it's to silence opposition and to neutralize the threat. And in the case of Berta, just when they couldn't do that, that's when they killed her, and I tried to really, that's very much sort of what I tried to let in the book, is that her murder was very much the grand finale of this sort of campaign of terror to try and to stop resistance to the dam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's turn to that. So as we know, Berta was assassinated in March of 2016. What do we know about her death? What were you able to uncover?
What we know is that she wins the Goldman Prize in 2015, right? And she wins the Goldman Prize for having successfully led a campaign to stop construction of the dam. Now, and the dam construction had been suspended, seemed, for a couple of years. There'd been a local leader had been murdered back in 2013. There'd been other ones, and some of the funders had pulled out, and sort of things just seemed quiet. There wasn't really anything to see. I mean, there was no talk of a dam concession having been cancelled, but there wasn't really anything, going on. And then in autumn of 2015, so September, October, construction activity restarts. And what we now know is that the dam company had been working on a plan B to move construction of the dam from one side of the river to the other side of the river. The thinking being that, okay, well, the other side of the river, the village, the community, is not an indigenous community. So therefore, we don't have to, it doesn't matter that we didn't follow any of these, in the ILO consultation. But obviously that's just absurd, because if you dam a river, it doesn't matter which side you actually do the construction on, you're still going to dam a river and stop water, divert the course of the water. So in September, October 2015, construction restarts. And so Berta and the community in Copin reorganize, so they're back to, how things were in 2013, protesting, doing mobilizations, trying to block the construction. And what we now know from the phone data and from the murder trial, what the judges ruled was that it was around November 2015 that the decision was taken by executives of the dam company, DESA, to murder Berta. And then what we see through the phone evidence are, these middlemen, sort of planning, planning the logistics. There's actually a failed attempt to kill her a month earlier in February. These two people, one who was never identified, one who ends up being convicted, go to her house on foot, but she's there with two of her daughters. And then eventually she, they look for, what we know is that they look for a more professional hit. And so that this group of hitmen, which were really just this group of poor young men from the north of the country, who the evidence suggests had killed before for money, were hired as a hit squad, so that we know that on the night of the 2nd of March, just before midnight, they break into her home, and she's shot 3 times in her bedroom in her pajamas. She's there. What they didn't plan for was that she was there with an old friend of hers, a Mexican environmentalist, Gustavo Castro, and he is also shot, but he survives by playing dead. So then these hitmen go off. Their job is done. They're sort of we know of 4 of them. The driver, the 2 that entered the house, and somebody that was the guy that who was coordinating is an ex-army guy. And then the phone data in the trial leads us to 3 other people, 2 of whom were connected with the dam company, a former security chief, who was a US trained ex-military officer, another military man who he had entered the armed forces with, and he's really interesting as well because he was an active special forces major at the time, en route to become for promotion to lieutenant colonel, very highly decorated. He'd fought alongside the coalition forces in Iraq. He'd been a peacekeeper for the UN. But we know from the phone data that actually at the time of the murder, his phone had been wiretapped because he was suspected of drug trafficking and kidnap. But here's another character, and the evidence suggests that he provided the gun at least for the aborted attempt in February. He was part of the logistical planning. And then you have the 7th person was the community and environmental manager of the dam company, and his key role was he managed the paid informants that the company had in the community that helped them, fed them information about what Berta was planning to do, where she was going to be, where the organisation were going to be protesting, and including on the run up to her murder. So that was the 7th person. So what we saw in the murder trial at the end of 2018 was that we saw some partial justice. The hitmen, the hit squad, and some middlemen being convicted of her murder. But we have never, until today, that those that ordered, paid for, enabled, and benefited from not just the murder, but for all those other, criminal acts, in the run-up, in the years before, the threats, the assaults, the criminalization, the land grabs, all of those things. Those people, those masterminds, the money men have never. Not only have they not been prosecuted, there's one that the president of the dam company has been accused of masterminding the crime and is in jail awaiting trial, but nobody else has even been interviewed under caution.
Wow. We have a number of questions that are starting to come in from our audience, and I wanted to begin with one, which is, did you ever meet Berta, and did she express concern about her safety or threats to her life?
Yep, I met her at the end of 2013, so I went to Honduras for the first time to cover the elections. Sort of was like the main motivation. They were meant to be the first free and fair elections since the coup. They weren't, but that's what they were meant to be. And I wanted to meet her. She was one of, as well as, and so I met her on the day of the elections, and she was giving a press conference to international observers and human rights delegates, really just warning them about the terrible repression and conditions in which, and the threats that the social movement had faced since the coup and continued to face. I mean, if you imagine at that time in Tegucigalpa, it was highly militarized. There were police everywhere. It was really a menacing environment. And I asked if she would for an interview, and she said yes. And I went up to her family home a couple of days later. I mean, at that time she was on the run from an arrest warrant that had been issued for this trumped up charge brought by the dam company. Which Amnesty International at the time had said that if she or her colleagues who had been charged with these crimes were prisoned, they would consider them political prisoners. But she was she was staying somewhere different every night. And that was I got to interview that one time only. I spent an hour with her, and she was just very clear about the context in which the violence was occurring, the threats and the repression were occurring, and the battle, in this particular dam, the Agozalca Dam, it being a very emblematic battle in a much bigger war, really. And she absolutely knew her life was at risk. I mean, she told me then, and I reported at the time for Al Jazeera, that she had been told that her name was on a military hit list, which included 15 other social movement leaders, that she was taking precautions as much as she could. Most of her kids were out of the country studying because the pressure was so intense at that time. But she said to me really clearly, saying, look, I am a human rights defender and I want to live. I love my country. It does not have to be this way. But no matter what precautions I take, when they want to kill me, they will kill me. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's how it turned out.
Okay. There are a number of questions about the United States and the extent to which we can understand sort of US or American culpability or accountability in the murder of Berta. I'm wondering if you can speak about that a little bit more. I mean, you touched on sort of, the question about sort of soldiers, being trained at the School of the Americas. Does it sort of begin and end there, or is there a broader American context that we need to know sort of currently if we want to understand the death of Berta?
I mean, I think it goes much further than that. I mean, the fact is, the political party that took control of Honduras after the coup continues to be in power, and has never really those actors, and it wasn't just the politicians. The coup was orchestrated by a network of business, economic sort of elites, religious, military, and political elites, who have all continued to thrive and benefit from the misery that's been unleashed in Honduras. They've never faced any consequences to that, not for the coup and not for Berta's murder, or not for the thousands of murders that have taken place since the coup, and so no consequences means impunity, and impunity is what breeds misery and violence. We can see that unfolding in the streets of the US today. The police brutality that we see today, the belief, or too many so-called law enforcement officers that they can kill with impunity, is because that's what they've been able to do, and it's the same no matter where you look at it. And so they haven't felt consequences. And I think, we know that elections, so-called elections since the coup, have been funded by money stolen from the public purse, have been funded by proceeds from the drug trade. Nothing changes. In 2017, the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, changed the constitution used illegal means, I would say, to influence over the courts and electoral commission to change the constitution to be allowed to stand again. The US said nothing, and then lost the election, but then claimed victory in what the whole world condemned as fraud. But the US embassy came out and said, we support the re-election. We back the re-election, the results. And so they have maintained, maintained, the current regime in power, and they're just bringing it right up to today. The US relationship with Honduras and other Central American, Latin American countries has always been very contradictory, because on one hand, you absolutely have to say that the murder trial in the case of Berta was exceptional, because generally there's 100% impunity for these crimes, right? And a lot of that came because of pressure from US lawmakers. The US embassy, the US gave resources, personnel and financial resources to help in that investigation, right? So on one hand, but on the other hand, and the New York prosecutors in particular have been very, very strong and in prosecuting high-ranking politicians and other public officials for drug trafficking and arms trafficking and money laundering, including the current president's brother a few months ago, in which case the president and his predecessor, who governed after the coup, were both named as co-conspirators in that international drug trafficking network, and yet nothing happened. In fact, immediately afterwards, the acting ambassador, US ambassador to Honduras, attended a public event with the Honduran president. So you have these really contradictory, policies. I mean, I think under the Trump administration, there is only one policy, and that is to keep Honduran Central Americans from reaching the southern border. That's it, but we absolutely have to recognize that the role of the international community, not just the US, other countries too, in legitimizing the post-coup regime, in which has created this toxic sort of mix of extreme poverty, inequality, violence, state-sponsored repression, sell-off of natural resources, a worsening urgent climate crisis, which is having an impact today on Hondurans, the robbing of public institutions like the health system, like the education system by the current political party. And that is why hundreds of thousands of Hondurans have fled, Honduras on foot towards a increasingly hostile country, because they are desperate. These are not people that are going out on some adventure. In my reporting in the region, within a couple of years, it was so clear to me that we were not talking about migration. We were talking about forced migration. We were talking about refugees. We were talking about people that were leaving because they had to leave. And really now the only policy that the Trump administration has is the stop the migrant policy. Which is why I expect it sort of said nothing about the fact the current president of Honduras has been named as a co-conspirator in a major drug trafficking organization, because that same person has agreed to be a third safe country to accept refugees from other countries, despite continuing to be one of the most miserable, sort of unequal, violent places in the Americas.
So we're beginning to run a little bit short on time, but before we close, I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about where things stand today with respect to environmental protection and justice in Honduras, and what does the legacy of activism that Berta left behind look like?
I think Berta's legacy is runs deep, and it will run for a long time. I think she was targeted because of who she was, because of the massive impact and reverberations her murder would have, not just in Honduras but beyond. If they could kill Berta Cáceres, they could kill anybody, and I think that really has had a huge impact. That people, it's taken a long time, for her organisation and other organisations to re-energise, to try to recover and move forward with that. Her family, her people were really left full-time fighting for justice for her. Do you know what I mean? It was them that did a lot of that work with coming to the US and coming to other countries, demanding that there be justice for Berta Cáceres. And so it could have been a real turning point in the positive evolution of the criminal justice system in Honduras, but it hasn't been, because nothing else changed. Nothing else changed. I think there was so much pressure from the international community for that trial to happen, but nothing else changed. At the same time, it was being weakened. And the criminal justice system and rights were being weakened at every given opportunity. I think the struggle goes on. I think that her children, her organisation, and way beyond that, continue to fight. This fight of collective grassroots organising. And I think one thing about Berta was a real pioneering, and that you see much more today, partly because of technology, as well, is that communities and struggles connect with each other. They have so much in common, and so they're not occurring in isolation from each other, as they're not occurring in isolation from the sort of economic and political context. And I think there is a lot of that collaboration that goes on, and I think that's very much part of Berta's legacy. And also just this sort of those pilgrim marches and that reivindication and pride of Lenca indigenous identity, that won't be lost. I think that was such a huge, has had a huge lasting impact, for generations to come. And I think that she will continue to inspire in what she achieved, in her words, in her in her capacity to unite, to compel, to convince. She was a great orator. I think those things will continue to influence generations to come.
Nina, thank you so much for giving us your time today, and thanks for writing such an extremely important book for those of us interested in Latin America, for those of us that are interested in human rights, and for those of us interested in environmental justice. It's a book that I recommend everybody get. Again, the name of the book is Who Killed Berta Cáceres? Dams, Death Squads, and an Indigenous Defender's Battle for the Planet, which has just been published by Verso Books. And thank you to everybody out there that's tuning in today. Be well, take care, and goodbye.